Thanks for being here.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, I guess I'll just again introduce Sammy Matsaw. He's a Shoshone-Bannock scholar from Fort Hall, Idaho, and he is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Idaho in water resources. And please join me in welcoming him to the University of Montana campus.
How matakiapi hianiashte ma o Oglala Lakota, just say that in my mother's language, just say good morning to everybody, and that I'm Oglala Lakota. But in my father's language, just say Ninaniha Sammy Matsaw Naite Patod. My name is Sammy Matsaw. I'm from Fort Hall, Idaho. Of course, introductions are much longer back home because we afford more time to each other, but I don't want to take up too much of your time this morning, so let's get moving on. So I just put a little play on things here because what's happening here, my introduction is, I just sort of want to play with this idea a little bit that usually what we expect from our students when they present their research or they're presenting something to in a university or college setting, we sort of have this white background with this very black on white sort of text talking very specifically about what our title is, what we're doing, and then what the talk is about, my name, and then some titles of status of who I am in today's date. That's sort of what we expect. However, I'm not usually following any sort of expectations. I like to sort of do things on my own, do things my own way, and in doing that my own way, just even my introduction this morning, those things can be a little unsettling, but I don't want them to be unsettling in a way that discomforts you. I want that discomfort for you to be something that you need to explore and start to think about more in a sense of what we expect and what we see as normal. So this is more of what I would like to show myself as. I like to show myself because my father's people are known for their beadwork. This is a symbol for my mother's tribe, that language I just used earlier. These are people in the past along rivers. These are people in the present along rivers. And some of the work that I've been doing within my dissertation. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these ideas about very diverse ideas of epistemologies and very deduced and reduced and restrictive ideas of epistemologies. So this idea here on the left compared to the idea there on the right, and I don't want to make this verses as in this versus that. I just want us to think about things differently in the context of how some people may see the world through different epistemologies and how they see the world very differently than what we expect, and then what we see here in these sort of figures that explain how we've deduced the world and our relationship with nature. So I'm a husband. Me and my wife, we are getting older, but we're trying to stay in shape because we have these younger kids. I also have another relationship that I had before, and I have older boys. And my son has these 2 daughters now, so I'm a grandfather, and those are my 2 granddaughters. So our relationships are complicated, they're complex, and we shouldn't just deduce them down to what our status is within our jobs. There's a lot of things going on in our lives that people need to understand, and you should share those things. So prior to European contact, this country was quite diverse. These are overlaps of territorial or sort of these usual and custom areas. There's the Shoshone-Bannocks in there. They have language groups that go all the way down into Mexico, so people are moving back and forth between these areas. Get a little bit more into that later. And then my mother's people, sort of there's this big giant coverage of them, but then it gets into very specific areas of where they were occupying. Those are also part of, sorry, that was language groups. These are usual and custom areas, and these are the ideas about how diverse the country was as cultures. And then there's these major dialects here too that don't even speak to each other. So there was a sign language, and that sign language was very important to how different language groups would communicate with each other. So for instance, I also wanted to acknowledge the land that we're on right now. So the Flathead, Salish, Kootenai lands. their Aboriginal lands. These are my great-grandmother's descendants as well. She came from here. So we come from, so my dad's people come from right here at the top of the Shoshone lands in the north here, the Lemhi Shoshones. Those, as you can see, there's overlaps with the Flathead and the Nez Perce and the Crow. So those are all different language groups. And in order for them to communicate, that's my last name, it's actually Matsaw. So when I say Tsa Bechua, I'd say Tsa Bechua. So I'd say good morning in Shoshone. When I say Sa, I mean something good, something that feels good to us. It's also a feeling. But Ma in our language, so when you get to the number 5, you say Managi. Managi is the number 5. And Ma, the base word to Managi is our hand. So this is Managi, number 5. So Ma and Tsa means good hand, the good hand speaker, but it's been shortened through colonization and changing our names. So the good hand speaker, so my great-great-grandfather was a translator, and he had a wife who he communicated with through sign language, and then they got married and started learning each other's language more. She died in Fort Hall. She's buried at our funeral, or our burial site in Fort Hall, Idaho. Of course, then through treaties, a lot of the lands were reduced down to these blocks and sort of these squares, and you can sort of see how things start to change. Continuing on through this idea, I want to acknowledge too that this is a project that's been going on with Native Lands at .ca. You can look them up, get some more ideas about sort of zoom in and out of these maps that they're creating. And those blank spaces are also areas that they just don't have a lot of good information on. So those aren't places that haven't been claimed or whatever. There weren't people there. So as an ecologist, I see fragmented landscapes since European contact. And this is a lot of what we see as Native people. We see our reservations being reduced down to these little pieces of land. And these are solid blocks, but a lot of these blocks of land are also reduced and have been turned into fee title land. And so a lot of our land bases are reduced. So as an ecologist, I understand fragmented landscapes through my culture and what our relatives are going through as animals and peoples. So I was at the University of Idaho doing my dissertation there at that red dot between Coeur d'Alene and Nez Perce lands. We've since moved home this past summer down back to our home in Shoshone-Bannock lands where my father's from. But as I mentioned before, this is where my mom's from. She's Oglala, Lakota. So she was young once and she took off from there and went west. She was going to Oregon, but she stopped there and ran into my dad and she didn't make it to Oregon. So then came me and my brother and my sister. So I just wanted to get a little bit more into this idea about what I'm talking about as far as lands and where I come from and how those lands have shaped my thoughts. And so my expansive thoughts, I think about this idea of my father's land. So if I stood up on a mountaintop, I could see across all of the mountains and I could see very expansively across the Rocky Mountains. But I also have this ability to think very deeply in my knowledge and how I learned from Shoshone-Bannock peoples. And so in these river-carved valleys, I have this idea about how my thoughts become very focused. And so that I take this idea and I'm identifying it very specifically with the idea of like father's sky. And so this blue triangle representing the sky. And then if I think about my mother's people here on the wide open plains, and very flat lands, this is the idea of being with my mom and my mom's people and how the land shaped my thoughts with her and what I inherited from her. And that deep knowledge came from maybe reducing that expansive landscape through living on a teepee floor. And so this is also where my deep knowledge would come from and being shaped from the land. So then I use this idea within our culture to think about a symbol for Mother Earth. And we put these together, we see these a lot. So we see these symbols a lot in our regalia, in our artwork, it's really a basis of our knowledge system. And so this is an idea about how we acknowledge both Father Sky and Mother Earth. And some of the old people, the way they acknowledge this too, they'll do it through hand gestures, and they do this. And we'll go through prayer, and some of them will do the sort of the Christian sort of like hand their hands out and be with prayer or whatever, but usually you'll see them too before the prayer is over, or even during the prayer they'll go like this. And that also means that they're acknowledging who they are. At least that's what I've noticed. Some people probably notice different things. So this is really a symbol of time. So if we think about time as this is the past and then the present, the sky being the past and the ground being the present and the future, we can think about these different ideas and examples of past, present, and future, sky, people, and earth, and song, people, and dance. And what I mean by the people, I mean all people, so plants, animals, and then song, people, and dance, that also those people are doing song and dances that we learn from those people. And I'll get into that too, and I talk about more than human relatives. We'll take this symbol of time, as if you're following along, just sort of kind of think about this idea about space. So people have different ideas in their epistemologies about time and space. And so we have this symbol for space, and it's a circle with these 4 equal quadrants, and they have to do with the north, east, south, and west. But if we bring these together and sort of have this model of an epistemology of Oglala Lakota people, we can sort of bring this idea together of this medicine wheel. And this medicine wheel is really a symbol of space and time, not necessarily just like some religious symbol or something that sort of demarks just spirituality. It's more than that. So what we're saying with this is that there's Father Sky, there's Mother Earth, there's our past, our future, and this is where we see ourselves on that landscape within that time and space landscape. So if we think about ourselves as this symbol of this circle, this is our body on the land. And how does our body on the land orientate itself? It orientates itself also through our senses, and not just the 5 senses of the normal 5 senses. So the idea of orientate ourselves through a physical sense by facing the west, the north, the mental sense of who we are, the east, the emotional sense of who we are, and then the south, the spiritual sense of who we are. And then I put a little play on this, right? So this is the man aspects. Men are very physical and mental. The hunters, and women are the gatherers, and we can sort of put these in categories if we wanted to, just to give a little bit more explanation. And then even being a little bit more, men are more objective and women more subjective. I don't really like that. I kind of just put it up there just to kind of communicate to an audience sort of what we're thinking that could be relatable to the way that they see the world. I'm talking about like a dominant European society. So we bring all this together. So I give an example of how this model could pertain to something like my dissertation, and how I'd go through my dissertation to figure out where I'm at. So as a scientist, as an ecologist, my 5 senses are shaped and perceived through STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But Indigenous thought then begins to change from there, because the way that I use science isn't necessarily in the idea that I'm going to increase my status in the world, but increase the status of my community. And so by doing that, I have this culturally based co-thought process, that it's not just my thoughts, that it's the thoughts of the people that I grew up with, the ways that my aunties and uncle raised me, the way that my father and my mother raised me. And so that I have to go back to my community, and I should have already been listening, but if I'm going back to my community, that I'm going to be listening to them very carefully, because what they're interested really in is our co-health, well-being of our society, community, family, and self. And that all of those are related to one another, that my well-being of my society, my community, and my family is the well-being of myself. And so there's these struggles in our community where we talk about a crab in the bucket scenario, but we can also, where, that someone's trying to go and become successful in life, and that everybody in my community pulls me down. Or you could look at it the other way around. That I think is a very European way of looking at it, that it's a competition. But if you look at it the other way, is that my community will be brought with me when I come forward when I become successful. They are successful. And so you could say that way, or you could say it the other way. I think they both have the same meaning and the same feelings, and we get frustrated about them. But I think it's our perception that gets us the most frustrated. Because really what we're trying to do, if we're trying to think about ourselves and our legacy and what we're trying to do within our lifespan, is we're trying to co-create, adapt, and reinforce oral customs and traditions. So if we're doing that and we're using this model and we're thinking about where we are, or where I am as a scientist or as an ecologist, whatever our discipline may be, we can use this model to then shape who we are and what we're doing. So that's my mother's sort of perspective on things, what I've learned from my mom's culture. And that what happens is that we're usually living in this world, that we see the world physically and mentally, that I think, therefore I am. And this very comes back to René Descartes, comes back to Hume, Popper, all of our great philosophers that we all get trained to understand. This is going on in classrooms on this campus, on campuses across this country, on campuses across indigenous or colonized countries all across indigenous lands. And so what happens for indigenous peoples is before they even step into a classroom, their ideas are already diminished to this. And if this is an idea about what is expected for them to be successful, then why shouldn't we be expecting them to fail? And so those ideas to me is that if you're only expecting me to be here 50%, then you should only expect me to apply myself 50%, and 50% is a failing grade. And so, so I think that's some of the bigger issues. So it's not that I think, therefore I am. It is I am because we are. And I come back to that idea because if I'm applying myself fully on who I am, I become very passionate about what I'm doing. I'm very much more involved. So I want to come back to this symbol because it relays lots of information to me from my dad's culture and people. As an ecologist, because it talks to us about different times of the year, what we do in those times of the year, and what is happening in those times of the year. So where we go get our food, what sort of dances bring in the honoring of those foods, and then so when and where, so how we use space and time within this model. So this is a model from my father's people, the Shoshone-Bannocks. And it's something we refer to as our seasonal round. Seasonal round it's complex, it's not just about food. And these are just a few examples, some of the major foods, but there's many, many foods and medicines that are among this idea. This is just an idea of some proportion of that idea kind of encapsulated in this symbol. I also I personalize this as much as I can to my own experiences, and so within this is my own panels of my own ideas about how I think of myself as an ecologist. And so on this panel is my father's people, so within this seasonal round, you'll see there's a camas, so these are camas bulbs, and then these are salmon. And so these are more my father's culture and people, and this is a Shoshone-style teepee, different style, has this bigger opening here because they use more teepee poles, they're more accessible, lodge pole is. Lodge pole being less accessible on the Great Plains, they have a smaller opening, so there's less poles, they make more use of with less. A buffalo, and then choke cherries, I have stories. So these are really stories around these food gathering events within my culture and my peoples. And then you'll see these accents of Father Sky, Mother Earth, and then the four directions that I described in the last slide. So that was sort of a symbol of my art, and then my idea as an ecologist, and sort of how I think about myself as an ecologist. So I want to come back to Viola Cordova. She says in How It Is in her book, she says, Native Americans are not usually questions about their theories of human nature. What could they possibly have to say that has not been said before? In the Western scenario of time and the universe, the Native American exists as a living fossil portraying earlier stages of Western man's singular climb to complexity on a teleological evolutionary path of the universe. If so, it is no more acceptable to engage a Native American philosopher in discussions of time and human nature than it would to be engaged a single-celled amoeba. So she's actually quoting somebody here from her own professional society. Viola since passed on. She was presenting Native American thought to American Philosophical Association, their national meeting. One of her peers stood up and said this to her. So she penned him down forever in her book as a way to kind of get back. And I think what she says in her book is a lot of things. This book was published posthumously, but the way she was laying it out was really breaking it down on how you build your identity as an Indigenous person. So who you are and your story, what shapes who you are. So a lot of the things that I just presented to you is modeled off of this book, and really gets into these deep ideas about what we think of ourselves as Indigenous people. So language and linguistics matter. So there's a part in here that she really got me thinking about things. So incommensurability, other cultures, other languages may not contain the same concepts. And that's really deep, because what it's saying is that there's concepts within other cultures that could be very valuable to humankind. And I'll get into some of that. We're working towards it. Hold on, slow down. Native languages are languages of verbs. Indo-English or European languages are languages of nouns, subjects. So subject are the ideas of how we think about things, very categorical, person, place, or things, that this is the way we think of the world. For Indigenous people in most native languages, we think of the world in verbs. This comes up in our treaty language. So the idea in our language was the language and said that we had the right to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States of America. What came in question was the idea of to hunt. So if it is the right to hunt, and there are these court cases, there's U.S. v. Washington, which the tribes of Washington were challenged on their fishing rights. There's U.S. v. Oregon, which the tribes of Oregon were challenged on their fishing rights. There would have been a U.S. v. Idaho, because we were being challenged on our fishing rights. However, the Idaho Supreme Court acknowledged our fishing rights in our court case. They brought in a cultural linguist, Sven Liljeblad. He was an ISU anthropologist at Idaho State University in Pocatello. He was living close to our reservation and studying our language. He was brought in as an expert on Shoshone language, Norwegian guy, whatever he was. So he comes in and he says, this word, if you translate to hunt into Shoshone or Bannock, the word taigi or hoai, taigi, it's not simply just the idea to hunt. It's a verb. It's this verb language of hunting, but it's not to hunt. It's to gather it's to obtain wild foods. But it's not even just about obtaining wild foods, it's what we're doing in that. So it's a bigger idea than just to obtain wild foods. It's about what we do, what we gather. So what do we put as a sack of tools or a bag of tools, or what do I bring with me? A knife, a rifle, a bow, whatever I'm bringing with me, that's what I'm bringing. Where am I going? Where are the stories about those places? What stories do I have personally within my family, my memories? What memories have been shared with me from my grandparents, my aunties, my uncles? What stories have been shared across our culture about these places through our stories? So mappings of the land. It's really about this idea of a culture that's attached to the idea of to hunt. And why wouldn't we assume that I'm saying as a larger people who have been raised within this very dominant society culture understand that there's a culture to the idea of hunting. When we watch people from European descent, they put on their camouflage, they make sure they load things a certain way, they have an ethic to it. There's all of this regulation around it, policy. There's this very old idea of aristocrats putting on their tweeds and going out and doing this very ethical hunting idea with shotguns and their dogs and families. So why wouldn't they think that there was a culture of an idea attached to this idea of to hunt? And so they were trying to deduce it down to this idea of the noun and what it means to hunt. And so how can we categorize that to make it exclusive for certain people and then exclude other things like fishing or gathering. So this is Paulo Freire. He kind of comes up a little early, but in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he talks about this idea of action and reflection, this word that equals work, and that's a praxis. So the way that people behave, this really comes back to the way that they think and the way that their thoughts are shaped. Benjamin Whorf, so he's also this guy that comes up in Viola's book. And I think he says this really well. He said, it is gratuitous to assume that a Hopi who knows only the Hopi language and the cultural ideas of his own society has the same notions often supposed to be intuitions of time and space that we, English speakers, have and that are generally assumed to be universal. So he studied the Hopi language, he was studying Mayan languages, and what he started to understand was that there were these ideas within their languages that English speakers don't have a concept for. And so he was coming back to these ideas about, in defense of this diversity of languages out there, that it's really important that we need to protect them. So I sort of play around with this. I get into these ideas as I say an entomologist sometimes, which is the study of bugs, and can be very much confused with the idea of an etymologist, which is the study of words. So as an ecologist, I do study bugs as a stream ecologist, and I play around with this idea about oikos and logia, that these are these old Greek words that means house and language or logos. The Germans brought these two words together and made this word eocology, and then we use this word ecology, which is the study of home. I do this because I don't want to take language for granted, and I really think about this in terms of this language speaker from the Lakota people. He says, Lakota is really specific in terms of describing different processes. For instance, chlecha, which means the idea to tear. If you tear something with your fingers, it's yuchlecha. If you tear something with your teeth, yachlecha. If you tear something with pressure, pachlecha. If you tear something with your foot, nachlecha. If the wind blows and tears something, it's wochlecha. And it goes on, there's more than this. But I'm just trying to emphasize the fact that Lakota language offers a different perspective, a different angle on the world we live in. So as you can see in this, the idea, what's really of interest isn't necessarily the ideas about what's at two ends of the nodes, but what's going on between them. And that you can put anything at the two ends of those nodes, but what's going on in between us, so this idea of to tear. So the tearing is what's interesting, not necessarily what's tearing. It's that the tearing is happening, and then what is tearing those things. So go back again to this idea about playing around with language. So this idea about endo, or within, to be born in, to be native within Latin language, and then this idea of gene, Proto-Indo-European language, to beget, birth, or produce, and bringing these together in the Greek language, endogenes are being born in the house, or indigenous. So then I come to this idea about being an indigenous ecologist. So if I'm born in the house on these lands, and my home is of interest, not Africa or South America or the Amazon, then I'm an indigenous ecologist. I'm doing my work in my land because it's important to my people. So methodologies. This is how it all gets shaped. So I'm kind of bringing it back to this idea about how do I shape my methodologies. So I have to think about this idea about what methodologies are. So there's this story in our creation about this woman who comes from the sky. She comes to the earth on these geese to Turtle Island. She brings forth all this life. Turtle Island is also what we call North America. So this indigenous process of knowing based on our stories, then our epistemology. So as if we're thinking about the land being a part of that story, not just as a background, but really foregrounding the land. It's this very living thing, very living entity. So if it's a turtle, it almost emanates this idea of a turtle, Turtle Island. So land as pedagogy, that we're learning from land, and land teaches us. We are in a learning, teaching, land-based relationship of these experiences. And that experiences is coming forth as this theory of grounded normativity. So grounded normativity is this idea that we are here on the ground, we know who we are, we know what we're doing, and that is normal, not what we think of in this other idea of normal, and that we're trying to make this normal again. And agency is all around us in many forms, and that these agentic forms, we change them and they change us, so as in matakiase, or all my relations. So all my relations, all living and non-living things, whether they be grandfather rock, a bird, a fish, or the standing tall silent ones, the plants, the forests. So we change them and they change us. What we do to them, they do to us. And that this organization is a communal with more than human relatives. And then this, so in this sort of idea of sort of taking the world apart for myself, Western Euro processes of knowing, this epistemology is based on a priori or a posteriori human experiences. And those experiences are reasons or empirical observations from the human perspective, and that the agency is humans only and anthropocentric, and agentic is that agents of investigations of the legal or science trainings of disciplines within their expertise, and that organization is humans are at the top of the hierarchy and everything else is below, and we are stewards of the land. So methodologies, not methods, injure. This is really important because we can't get too wrapped up in that idea. I'm not trying to say, okay, that's the bad guy and we're the good guys, and it's not like that at all. It's just the idea of what kind of harm that comes from that idea of having everybody sort of see the world that way. And so I'll go back to Benjamin Whorf, and he said that, he argued that paying attention to how physical phenomena are described in the study of linguistics could make valuable contributions to science by pointing out the ways in which certain assumptions about reality are implicit in the structure of language itself and how language guides the attention of speakers towards certain phenomena. In the world which risk becoming overemphasized while leaving other phenomena at risk of being overlooked. And I use these two examples specifically because here in the Columbia River Basin, or sorry, a little more west of here in the Columbia River Basin, people were overlooking the importance of lamprey. Actually, are trying to eradicate them. Come to find out they're a very important part of the ecosystem. Probably going extinct, but there's not enough information because nobody cares about them to ESA list them. The same for native freshwater mussels, which are also being threatened by invasive mussels. These are also very important to the contributions of stream ecosystems and being overlooked. There is one institution in the West that is doing any research on them. That's the University of Idaho, and one lab at University of Idaho, which is the lab that I'm in. And so that kind of gives you an idea of how imperiled they are, even in what we're doing about them. So this Indigenous Statistics book by Walter and Anderson, so she's an Aboriginal woman and Anderson's a First Nations Cree. They have in their book something that gets at this idea of methodologies, injure, or methods. Sorry. Quantitative work is seen as both, so we're going to get into this idea a little bit about statistics and sort of how we perceive statistics. Quantitative work is seen as both foreign and as the epitome of colonizer-settler research methodology in action. A view that positions indigenous methodologies and quantitative research as fundamentally incommensurable and, as such, to be either critiqued or avoided altogether. So that's a mouthful, but really what it's saying is that there's this narrative that we get to hear from this that isn't so good all the time. So when we hear statistics, we usually hear stuff like, you know, high suicide rates, incarceration rates, homelessness, unemployment, and reduced life expectancy. So this is statistics to us. So when we see a statistics class listed and that was part of our major degree and that we need to take it in order to graduate, this becomes very difficult for us because these are the statistics that we hear. However, when we do use statistics, it's really interesting about the sort of information that we come up with. So in this paper by Megan Bang, she uses some study design, some statistics, and her cultural mosaics and mental models of nature shows that within this young people and community on the reservation compared to an off-reservation community, so mostly white people compared to Native people, she showed that young Native people are very astute about ecology up until kindergarten, and then at kindergarten they start to fall off. Their ideas of ecology start to decrease. And then right around puberty age, which really is important for a lot of our indigenous cultures, is we have puberty ceremonies where we reinforce their connections to land. Just so happens that when they're going to school, that their interests in ecology start to then drop off. From there forward, STEM fields, ecology, whatever it may be, all of those drop off. Of course, graduation rates drop off, and people graduating just from high school is a very difficult thing to show successes in. She also shows that there's ideas within how we learn. And so she does these interviews with people and shows that if they bring up this idea about fishing, how do they tell stories about fishing? And she showed that the off-reservation people show very immediately that they bring up the word fish or fishing. Whereas in Native communities, she had to put a number on it because in her structured interviews, they would run out of time before they even got to mention a fish. And it's really important because I was a teaching assistant in ichthyology, or the study of fishes. In the study of fishes, we start the semester talking about the skeletal structure of fish, the muscles of fish, the guts of the fish, yada, 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 yada. We build the fish from the very basic components to, at the end of the semester, we get to talking about how important they are in ecosystems, where they're most productive in the world and why. So the most interesting parts about fish comes up at the end of the semester, and you know, professors, what happens at the end of the semester? They're scrambling. And so how much time do they get to spend on the most interesting part? Very little to none. And so what happens is that over and over, so even when I took ichthyology, my complaint was that we got to the most interesting part and then the semester was over and I felt like I got robbed. Just so happens when I became a teaching assistant, a lot of the students, whether they are white or not, were saying the same things. What we're saying with this is in multicultural education, everybody succeeds. And this is a really good example of that because what we should be doing is teaching ichthyology by teaching about ecosystems first. And that's really how people learn. And that's how Indigenous people are still holding on to. They build ecosystems first. And maybe they'll talk about the fish. But that's really what storytelling is. So if we come back to these other ideas, what we're doing is we're talking about building ecosystem, and then we'll talk about specific ideas within those ecosystems and how a certain fin structure makes more sense of what that structure is for in a given system, whether it's a lake, an ocean,